welcome back to Procurement and Supply Chain Live Singapore 2025. Let's move on to our next keynote session about unlocking transparency in supply chains, how AI is strengthening integrity and resilience. This is with Holly Miller, Global Head of Supply Chain Intelligence and APAC Head of Fraud Solutions at Quantexa. Hi Holly, how are you?
Really good, thank you. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Now, this title was one that really jumped out at me. I'm really fascinated to see what you've got to go through. So the virtual floor is yours, and I'll be back with some questions at the end.
Thank you so much. I guess starting with a little bit of context and a quick intro on myself and why I'm here and why I'm talking about this today. So over the last 20 years, I've been supporting organizations, so corporates, banks, governments, often tackling some of their most complex and critical challenges related to fraud, corruption, integrity, sanctions evasions, and just general disruption. Across all these issues, an organization's supply chain, its third parties, and truly understanding who an organization is doing business with has been key. Over time, my work has been less about looking back and investigating what went wrong to preventing this from happening again. And again, over time, the role of data technology has become increasingly important. At Quantexa now, within the product organization, this is all I focus on, how data and AI can enhance the integrity and resilience of an organization. So what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes, hopefully you won't be hearing too many buzzwords or too many theoretical approaches about how AI is the silver bullet that's going to solve all your problems, but more practically, what are some of the techniques that can increase that transparency and where can they be applied to strengthen integrity and resilience? So I'm going to begin with the challenge, and this won't be news to many people, I'm sure, watching. Really, you only need to pick up the newspaper or look at the headline on your phone to see the latest political announcement or climate event that's impacting global supply chains. Donald Trump has not been helping me with preparing in advance for this session. News is moving so quickly. Organizations are having to react very quickly. So whether that's a country that's been, or an individual who's been sanctioned, whether that's tariffs increasing to 25%, logistics issues caused by conflict, often the impact of this is diversification, more suppliers onboarded much faster, potentially with increased use of intermediaries, and then the associated integrity issues where control issues where in local markets are just trying to get stuff done. This only makes things more challenging, reducing transparency even further. I've put some of these, the impacts of this on this slide, but really to kind of ask questions around how can we protect against regulatory, reputational risks if we don't have a clear view of our supply chain ecosystem. So, sanctions evasion, foreign interference, it's impossible to see or prevent if we can't see who we're actually doing business with. And the same from a resiliency perspective, like without that full transparency of that multi-tier supply chain, how can we truly understand the direct or the knock-on impact of a world event? So where does AI come in? Where can they help increase this transparency? So AI is obviously very, very broad and it's existed for decades, essentially the ability of machines, computers to think like a human, so well before ChatGPT came in. But often if you talk about AI today, actually up until very recently, when you talk about AI, it was all about machine learning. So where generally it's about learning from the past, understanding large volumes of data to predict risk, to predict opportunities. I've got a stat there in the top right-hand corner, which is relatively recent, so 2023 from Gartner, that 40% of high-performing organizations are optimizing decisions with AI, machine learning. I expect in the short time since 2023, that's closer to 100%. Even if they don't know it, it's most likely embedded in a lot of the technology that they're using today in their supply chain. And used across so many different areas and extremely successful in many of these cases. From my world, a lot of the places where I've seen this is in risk prediction, risk mitigation, So analysing large external data sets to predict the impact of disruption, or even machine learning models that I can identify, likely corrupt payments, etc. But the call out I've got on this slide is really that machine learning is only as powerful as the data that powers it. So data inaccessibility, the lack of labeled data or known outcomes, lack of context, and data quality issues can really impact the effectiveness of these machine learning techniques. The second area, so generative AI, that I'm going to focus on, the area of AI and the use of large language models, so the ChatGPT, DeepSeeks of the world. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes talking about that. I'm sure there's people in the conference today that can cover it much better than me. But so many broad and varied and powerful use cases to increase transparency alone. Again, we've got another 40%, a different 40%, and this is even more recent, Jan 24 from EY, supply chain organizations and investing in Gen AI. I expect, again, that's closer to 100% just in 12 months. In terms of what can it do around that transparency, one call out, one of many examples, the ability to make sense of historical data. So what can be the impact of market conditions, geopolitical events, weather patterns within the supply chain, getting that visibility that's been very challenging previous to that. But again, the consistent thing you're seeing in those two broad areas of AI is only as powerful as the data that powers it. So really dependent on the quality of the data that feeds the model. And this is where, personally, over the last 3-4 years, I've focused a lot of my time at Quantexa. It's actually getting the data ready for AI, ready for these techniques, which actually in many cases is powered by AI itself, but to really obtain the full benefit of these investments and to get that transparency into the supply chain. So I'm actually going to kind of show what this looks like using a bit of a visualization infographic. So if you can imagine, this is a universe or maybe a galaxy of different stars representing different data points relevant to supply chain. And actually, if you look at traditional and not so traditional as well, some of the examples that I've just spoken about before, monitoring, often it's considering limited context and limited data points to make those decisions. For example, the one on the top right might be a machine learning model applied over your supply chain management system, so invoices and POs, to identify high-risk transactions in relation to fraud or corruption. This one down here might be an adverse news monitoring system set up to identify potential disruption within the supply chain. You might have at the bottom left, that might be your compliance due diligence process. So the screening you do against external data to identify integrity risks at the point of onboarding. Top left might be the chat functionality you have within your supply chain management system to understand trends, comms, identify risk within that system. But again, many of these are kind of looking from the outside in, looking from the inside out, and it's missing that crucial context. So really important to be able to join all of that together and get that kind of unified contextual view of your supply chain ecosystem. So some of the key techniques about getting data ready for AI, and I'm not going to get too technical, I don't have long enough, and I'm probably not the right person to either, but some of those key techniques are concepts of entity resolution and graph analytics. And these are techniques which have really been pioneered by Quantexa and actually its founders for a number of decades now. So entity resolution is all about obtaining a single view of the same entity. So an entity being any real world thing. So that's commonly a person, an individual. It could be a place, a business, a device, a product. But actually that capability is not trivial, absolutely not trivial. And for anyone who's tried to do that themselves, especially when we're talking about data sets that have never been designed to be joined together in the first place. So having data within a purchase order versus trying to link that to a news article is very difficult. But actually what that then gives you when you've got all your relevant internal, external data sets, some might be structured, some might be unstructured, is a unified view of all the relevant data to understand that supply chain ecosystem. It's then actually when you've got that unified view that you can start to build much more context. So using capabilities like graph analytics. So understanding how these different entities behave and interact together. If I just go to the next visual. So being able to understand and identify potentially hidden connections, especially in the case coming from my world of more kind of financial crime entities that have deliberately obfuscated their identities, or identifying complex or high risk behavior. And importantly, understanding how all these entities within your ecosystem are interconnected. So if an event was to occur, what would be the impact across your whole supply chain ecosystem? So working now a lot with organizations who are trying to do exactly this and bring all these different approaches and all these different AI techniques together. So importantly, starting with that unified contextual view of the supply chain ecosystem and seeing how that can then supercharge some of the other AI investments that an organization is making, improve the results of those other AI projects, enable better decisions, increase transparency, increase integrity, etc. So that might include looking at relationships from internal data, so information around customers, wholesalers, agents, distributors, manufacturers, actually the transactional detail beneath that, and connecting that to corporate data, shipping data, customs data, inference from news. So getting a really contextual view of that multi-tier supply chain. And then constantly scanning the news to identify, not only events that are happening today and the potential knock-on effects of that, but early warnings of events that might happen, and exactly where Gen AI can be used to identify, what were the early warnings of the pandemic, and how can we pick those up much earlier in this case. So when you have that supply chain ecosystem mapped out, that's when you can start to make decisions and act upon it. So using those other AI techniques, so applying machine learning models, that might be a risk model to automatically identify integrity risks. That might be foreign interference, that might be corporate sanctions risk, etc., sanctions evasions, and impacts of potential resiliency and weaknesses. And importantly as well, using some of those Gen AI techniques to actually ask questions of the data. So ask questions of that ecosystem, simulate world events, identify threats and potential optimization opportunities. Now, I promised that this wouldn't just be theory and silver bullet, and this is how you're going to answer all your problems. But I wanted to talk to you a couple of examples. So real world examples in this case of where exactly that approach has been applied. So starting with that unifying and contextualization, if that's a word, I think so, of data, and building from that. So I'm going to start with a real life case study. I'll see how I'm going for time. I've got a few of these, which is very close to my heart, around corruption, hidden conflicts of interest, etc. So in this case, this is a real case study out of Europe, where a health contract was awarded, actually valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And actually all products received did not meet the requirements and were destroyed. So essentially a significant loss to taxpayers. And in this case, the unified contextual data that you can see on the right, or a subset of it. So we've got here internal information, so around contracts and onboarding data that the contracts are being awarded, corporate registry information, offshore leaks databases, so information around businesses and individuals named on like Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, etc. Watch list data, external news, and importantly, understanding the entities contained within that data and the relationships between those entities in that data. So what can we see? What can we gain? What transparency do we now have around this relationship and this transaction? So if you actually look on the left-hand side of the graph or the network diagram, you have a business inside a pink or purple circle. And actually that's the single view of the business entity that was awarded this multi-million-dollar contract. And we can see actually linking that through to corporate registry information that business was only incorporated a number of days before being onboarded. So actually looking at the risk there by bringing in that context, is there a risk there that potentially this is a phantom company that was created for the purpose of this contract? If we look at point 2, this is where we're starting to apply some of our ML techniques. So in this case, a supervised machine learning model, which has been trained to identify likely shell companies. In this case, there is a high number of businesses closely connected to the company that received the award, which have been identified as very likely to be a shell. Shell companies can be used for legitimate purposes, but they're also very commonly used for fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, corruption, etc. Point 3 is around the use of graph analytics to identify, in this case, hidden conflicts between the business and a publicly exposed person. So if you look on the right-hand side and the individual there that's circled, this is actually a publicly exposed person, and you can see we can connect that person to the business that received the award in a number of different ways via shared directorships, shared addresses, etc. Actually, it turns out in this case that individual was also closely involved in the awarding of that contract as well. We've also got showing that capability of getting that, that single view of that entity, a number of other risk flags around that PEP, links to tax avoidance, offshore companies, watch lists, and also a number of dissolved and insolvent businesses, which is an interesting risk flag. It could be a sign that they're a bad business person, but also it could be a sign of more sinister things like Phoenix operations, etc. Again, with this one, actually, what could be the action? So in this case, if this approach was applied, and this happened a number of years ago now, this risk would have been automatically identified and the supplier would never have been onboarded. So this risk can be automatically identified at the point of onboarding. Just checking how I'm going for time. A few more minutes. I'll go through one more and see how we're going for time. So this example here, again, real data, real case study, a little simpler in terms of the network or the graph that you're seeing there on the screen. So in this case, it's around unifying that data to get transparency into multi-tier supply chains. So in this case, we have internal data around a significant contract being awarded for a critical project in Asia. That's highlighted there with that kind of pinky purple circle. And in this case, we can actually use shipping information to understand a significant second tier manufacturer based in Thailand that's linked through to that project. And then what we can see actually by building information around that second tier supplier, that corporate registry information is telling us that supplier is insolvent and has actually reported negative shareholder funds in the last year. So in this case, again, by applying at that starting point, using AI techniques to build that view and identifying those early warning signals of interruption to a critical project, supply chain resilience can be automatically alerted. And actually, this is where the Gen AI techniques come in as well, right? So how can Gen AI then recommend an alternative supplier with strong financial performance that can provide that same service? I think I'm at 20 minutes. I did have one more example, but I'm probably going to skip that for the purpose of time. I guess we've got 5 minutes questions. I'm not sure how many we'll get to, but just to say, very welcome to take any questions offline, either via the website or please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, etc. So I know that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour.
Very much, Holly. You covered a huge amount there. Thank you so much. A few questions for me initially here is, how do you feel there is almost a race here between the technology to stay ahead of the issues and the issues that are chasing them, or the world changes that are changing them? How do you feel that is progressing at the moment? Are we staying ahead of the problems, or is it a constant battle?
I wouldn't say we're ahead. I would say the technology exists, but we need to get it. We need to get it there. It's an interesting one. Like I think I said at the start, even preparing for this session, everything I kind of planned to talk about before I I went to have a look at my notes again, and it already happened. Like, things are moving so quickly. Some of the interesting things, chatting to our head of innovation at Quantexa, and some of the things it's looking at right now is not just looking at an event when it happens and what the knock-on impact will be, but actually using that Gen AI to predict and go back and understand all those early warning signals. So how can you get in there much earlier, and how can you automatically detect and identify those early warning signals so you can get ahead? So there's lots of people really focused on these areas, and I think a lot of the technology is there. It's now a case of applying it and hopefully trying to keep up with all the mad things that are happening in the world right now.
And looking ahead to the future, where do you feel the potential is for this kind of technology? Because it's so exciting when you see these case studies and how it connects together, because everyone, when it comes to talking about trends, is always talking about resilience and making sure you've got the intelligence and the data, which is always very easy to say, but often harder to action. How do you feel the potential looks for this kind of technology in the near future?
I think it's really exciting for me. It used to be a little bit of what I talked about, and then now I spend all my days and often my nights, sadly, talking about this as well. So there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of organizations that are going on this journey. I guess one thing to say is you don't have to start right at the deep end. It can be iterative. So, for example, actually, the first case study that I shared, the government there is now a customer of ours and is using Quantexa to build out exactly that. There's a lot further they could go. There's so many more relevant data sources, but actually you're getting incremental uplift each time you start to build and expand that universe. So I guess there's always a place to start. And yeah, it's really exciting to see where a lot of our prospects and customers are going with it.
Absolutely. Well, Holly, I'm afraid we are right up on time. As you say, if anyone does want to take that offline, just reach out to you on LinkedIn. You can take things from there. Thank you so much for joining us at Procurement and Supply Chain Live Singapore. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome indeed.